You're on.
Okay, thank you, Amira. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Buying and Selling a Business, Part 2. Most of you, I think, were on yesterday, but for those of you who weren't, going to have to just jump in. We are at COVID-19 valuation. We finished yesterday with traditional business valuation, and now we want to talk about some thoughts Don and I and the lenders have about valuation since COVID-19. So my colleague Don Hobbs is on, and I'm also would like to introduce Renee Wood of Wells Fargo Lending and Joe McClear of Multifunding, who are SBA lenders, and they're going to participate today as well. Okay, so for 3 months of contemplating our navels after COVID hit, deciding what we would do about evaluation of businesses, this is kind of what we came up with. We put the businesses into 3 categories. Those not affected by COVID. Some are even doing better. Don, we've seen bike shops and liquor stores doing pretty well. A lot of construction is doing well. I'm seeing between 20 and 30% increases in some of these businesses.
Yeah, at least 30% in some. It's amazing.
Yeah, and we're kind of needing to decide what to do with those as well, the spikes. Then there are the businesses that were partially affected. We decided buyers will value these cautiously. They're looking at what is called the rebound rate. How soon can you get back to normal? And some may not return to their old normal. They're going to have a new normal. And then there are some that are still shut down, although it's fewer and fewer every day. It's seeming if you aren't up and running by now, in most cases, it's not good, but we're entering into another dip. So while we kind of were starting to get away from this, we decided to keep it in the show. So the businesses not affected by COVID, these are going to be really desirable. There's a very strong buyer market out there right now for reasons we're going to talk about later. We think the valuations on these businesses will hold or maybe even improve. And so for these businesses that are seeing some growth, the question is that going to continue? Is that your new normal? Did these businesses just get a bonus blip, or will there be more business in the future? Let's just take bike shops because we all love those. Everybody wanted to be outside. Bike shops sold out of bikes for the first time ever. I'm talking to somebody right now. He can't get tires. He can't get tubes. It's crazy. There will be some new converts to the sport. People love it. They'll move up the food chain, buy better bikes, more equipment, all of that. And some of them will gather dust in the garage. But some of the sellers we're talking to would like us to value the business on 2020 numbers. Don, what do you think about that?
Well, I saw a bike shop that was up 30% this year, and then they wanted to do a pro forma to show continued growth of 10% a year off of that over the next 5. And I think that was a little optimistic.
Yeah. And so the seller's going to have to sell the buyer on that is going to continue, and maybe in some ways participate in that upside. If it's there, they should get rewarded. If it isn't, the buyer shouldn't pay for the blip. Lenders, we think that you'll want to finance those businesses. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. How would you guys view the blip?
So if it depends on if it's truly a one-time blip due to COVID, I think that can be overcome, and we've seen those overcome. But if it's COVID plus other challenges, that would be difficult. But if it's a one-time extraordinary blip, we are seeing those with multiple lenders get moved forward to the closing table.
Okay. Anyway, these businesses have been going strong since the entire pandemic. For a lot of them, it's like nothing happened. Then the partially affected businesses. Don, you and I, early in the pandemic, were working on a spa. And that spa was doing great at the beginning of the year, and our lenders would have loved it, right?
Absolutely. It was a profitable, well-run, established business, had all those positive influencers we talked about yesterday, and could absolutely demonstrate with good books and good financials, good customer records that it was a transferable value.
Then came COVID. They got shut down for a while. Then they were allowed to open up again, but at a limited capacity. I think they were getting more and more business, and now we're being shut down again. So we decided that this business, assuming that they can hang on, will probably return to full capacity when everything is good, but it's a struggle right now. Financing is going to be on a case-by-case basis with our lenders, subject to assumptions and scrutiny, but lenders, would you touch that right now, or how would you deal with it?
If the business is not operational currently due to mandates in place, it would be challenging. But once they're open and resume and seeing clients again, if we could take a look at, there are some lenders that are going to ask for more detailed financials once the business does reopen. But I wouldn't say it's impossible. It's just, you've got to find the right lender that can assist.
Yeah, they're operational. They're just limited. Beyond, and to no fault of their own, they're not able to operate at full capacity right now.
Right. And there are also some challenge there. Suzanne, I know probably later in the show you'll talk about this, but I am seeing some deals where there's some seller carry to help with some of the adjustments due to COVID.
Yeah, we're going to talk about some of that creativity in a
Okay.
little bit. For these businesses, it's really important that these sellers have current monthly financials, professionally prepared, and the prior periods. Early in the pandemic, lenders were looking to do pro formas on these businesses. We haven't seen too much of that in reality. Joe and Renee, are you seeing a lot of pro forma financials being prepared and working off of those now?
We're looking
it's still not a heavy basis for, it's still not a backbone for cash flow or valuation. I'm certainly seeing it, be pushed a little bit, but it definitely does not hold, the amount of weight that I suppose some folks hope it would as they're trying to use leverage.
Okay. We're going to talk about creative deal structures, give you some examples of those. So expect it with these kinds of businesses. And then the totally shut down, not opening, probably getting to the point where liquidation of the tangible and some of the intangible assets might be how it has to go. You can sell off intangible assets. I've seen business names sell, customer list, any intellectual property. For those businesses that have a facility and a lease, this is where it gets touchy. First, is there a personal guarantee? If there isn't, that's a lot easier for them. Can the owner get out of it or get somebody else to take it over? We're going to see a lot of restaurant spaces available, I think. But on the other hand, for somebody who's coming in with no debt load, coming into a totally built out restaurant, which those can approach 200, 250 a square foot to build out, that can be a dream come true. And bankruptcy may be something that they have to consider and talk to their attorneys. So pretty sad for some of those folks. Okay, does anybody have any questions on COVID valuation? We're going to touch on it more with strategies, et cetera, but any questions?
No questions so far.
Okay. Done. Was I going to do recasting or you?
Either way,
I think I'm going to do it. Yeah. Okay.
I think you were. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Just a reminder from yesterday, SDE, seller's discretionary earnings, all the money one working owner, no debt, can make on a business. What we do is we calculate the EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation on the business, add back the owner's salary, discretionary expenses, add or subtract normalized expenses, and add one-time expenses to get to the SDE. So we're going to show you a real live tax return and go through that calculation for you. So in your handouts, you have these exhibits. Exhibit 1 is an 1120S US tax return for an S Corp. Probably a lot of the people who have businesses are S Corps. This is what it looks like. I am going to, so we've got a business doing 2.5 million in sales with a cost of goods of 1.3 million, leaving them a gross profit of 1.2 million. On line 6, you can see that. Now I'm going to go to our add backs. And here it is a little bit better blown up. So on line 21 of this tax return, the business has a profit of $125,000. I am going to show you how we get a $400,000 SDE out of that. So go up to line 7, compensation of officers. You need to verify that you've just got one officer and that the officer is the owner of the business. Non-owners can be officers. But in this case, we verified one individual was receiving W-2 wages of $150,000. If you remember from owner's salary yesterday, this has got to be found in either owner's salary, W-2 wages, or guaranteed payments to partners if you're an LLC. Distributions don't count. So we just added 150 to our SDE there. If you remember Don telling you yesterday, the I in EBITDA is for interest. In this case, the business spent $30,000 on interest. The next owner of the business, the buyer, probably will not have the same debt structure. If they have no debt, they can put that $30,000 to the bottom line. If they have different debt, they can apply that $30,000 to their debt structure. So we're going to add that back. Don also talked to you about the D in EBITDA, depreciation. $25,000 they spent, or they expense. Sorry, nobody spends money on depreciation. The IRS allows you to write it off. However, in realistic business valuation, you need to look at what asset replacement you are going to have to do. And if you buy, for example, an equipment rental business, you'll have huge depreciation, but you have to buy new equipment every year because people beat the crap out of the stuff you rent to them. So you need to figure that out and see if that depreciation really is cash flow to you or if it really is an expense. There are some discretionary expenses. Line 17, profit sharing pension. Okay, IRS allows you to write that off. Need to verify that this was just for the owner of the business, but if it is, it's an add back. And then on line 19, there's a wonderful set of deductions called other deductions. It's a separate sheet. So I'm going to show you that. In this case, 190,000 of additional expenses were taken by the business. Here is what this looks like. And for some reason, our sellers love to give us the tax return without this, but this is where all the goodies are found. So I'm going to show you what those look like a little bit closer up. So line 2 of this, the in EBITDA, amortization. This business is a franchise. Franchises get to write off their franchise fees. Not their fees, I'm sorry, their initial franchise cost of getting into the franchise. So $10,000 they got to write off. Remember, we talked about discretionary expenses. On line 3, we have automobile and truck expenses of $15,000. For simplicity, we are just going to assume that this is all PERC. It never is. You've got to figure out the ratio of PERC to business usage. But for simplicity in this example, 15,000 add back auto and truck. Line 17, legal and professional. In this is a one-time expense. The business had an issue with an employee. They spent $10,000 in legal fees. It's not going to happen again. The buyer won't have this expense, so we add it back. Continuing on, line 31 of this document, travel. That's one of those discretionary expenses. We are going to assume again for purposes of this discussion, that's all PERC. So let's look at what that looks like. Exhibit 3, you can see our $125,000 in profit that the business made. The next section is the EBITDA section, except for owner's salary. It's the owner's salary plus interest, depreciation, and amortization added back. These are the ones that our lenders love, very rarely question, right?
That's correct, yes.
The next one are the discretionary, automobile and truck, retirement, and travel and entertainment. I'm gonna guess that the retirement, that's pretty much a given. The lenders like that and accept it. The automobile and truck and the travel and entertainment, they may get a little bit fussier about, ask for more documentation, or plain and simple not carry on it. Ask the seller to carry on that. Okay. The one-time expenses, legal expense, we added that back depending upon verification, etc. Most lenders, I think, will accept it if it can be proven. In this case, we didn't have any normalized expenses, but that would be a plus or minus as well. As you can see, the total add backs, 275,000. So significantly more than the net profit of the business of 125. But adding those together is how we got our 400,000 of SDE. That cleared everybody?
Suzanne, I think it's really important. While it's a very large number in terms of the add backs, there's very little in terms of the discretionary types of spending there. I mean, these are really all approvable by the lenders.
Yes, I would guess that this would be a business that could get lending on, assuming the buyer had the right skill sets to run the business and prior tax years were similar. Any disagreement on that, lenders?
No, I agree.
Now, when I see 80% of the cash flow in discretionary expense add back, I don't even call a lender. So, but we just figure that they're not, the seller is going to be the lender in those cases. Anybody want to add anything to this? Questions? Here is it a little bit, I should have shown you a little bit bigger.
No questions.
Okay. Questions? No? Okay, Don, I think you're up for
right.
traditional purchase financing. And lenders, you're up too.
Yeah, definitely. We're going to be calling on them. When you look at any business purchase to pay for it, there are actually only three large buckets that the money is going to come from. So the cash over here, yes, it is cash. Another term for that could be a buyer's contribution to the sale, because this is the money that the buyer is bringing. It's often considered the down payment or something like that, but it's the money that's coming from the buyer. The other two places that money are going to come from is there's going to be financing from a lender, typically an SBA lender. That's what we see most frequently with a small business. And if the amount of money from the buyer and the SBA lender don't add up to 100% of what it's going to take to make this purchase happen, and there's some other reasons for seller financing, that really becomes the third piece. So it's the three legs on the stool: money from the buyer, money from the bank, and then some financing from the seller. So think of that. That's the big picture of all of any business purchase. Okay. We can move. And what's the buyer looking for? For the money they bring forward, they're going to be putting time into running this business. They're investing some money, and we talked about those. We saw that investment chart where the return on that investment is. They're going to want to see that return because there's risk in buying any small business. And so you want a return on your investment commensurate with that risk. And the buyer needs the ability to service debt. That's the continued profitability of the business and the ability to pay off what they've borrowed to purchase it. So that's what they're going to be looking for in any transaction. So the cash from the buyer, the buyer's contribution to this sale, again, sometimes known as the down payment, if you will. There's a number of places that's going to come from. Personal bank accounts. So let's say you're doing a sale. Again, we're doing a $500,000 sale, and the buyer's required to bring 20% of it. That's $100,000, just to use an example. So personal bank accounts, they may have that money there or they may not. They may have stocks or mutual funds that they can sell. Portfolio borrowing is becoming more common. We're hearing the term, but you're borrowing against your portfolio of investments. And then you're using the cash from that to bring it forward. You might have either investment real estate, which you could sell or borrow against. You might have personal residence where you can get a home equity loan. I think that's one of the really common ones we see, Suzanne, especially people here where homes have appreciated so much in value. There's a lot of opportunity to borrow against a home and use it for the purchase of a business.
Yep.
You might have an IRA or a retirement plan that can be liquidated. There is and we see that frequently. The other way that we use IRAs, retirement plans, is in this next item. It's called a rollover as a business startup, which is a ROBS. And a ROBS can be used if you set, I don't want to get into too much detail on it, but if you set up your business as a C Corp, you can take the money out of your IRA and without penalty. And instead, you're going to redirect the investment that was formerly going towards mutual funds or other corporations. You're going to redirect that back towards your own C corporation, which you're going to become an employee of. And you're able to use that money and, in essence, repay yourself to refund that ROB. So that's becoming very popular. We're seeing that more and more.
And that can be used in conjunction with an SBA loan.
Correct. fact, I'm working with a business right now where they're looking at doing that exact same thing, SBA loan plus a ROBS. And then family and friends. So, you can in fact get money from family and friends. It cannot be in the form of a loan because that's going to create additional indebtedness. The SBA lenders will look at that. They're not going to want to have that indebtedness as well as their own SBA loan. It can be in the form of a gift, and there's some seasoning involved in that. Just really quickly, I'll go to Joe. Joe, do you want to talk about money that's come from family and friends and how you as an SBA lender look at it?
Yeah, it's certainly allowable, as you mentioned. Yes, you will have to prove seasonality. So in essence, if a family member or a friend or a partner is going to help you with equity injection, they're going to be required to show 2 months of bank statements to prove that the money has existed. It did not just appear out of nowhere. And the only other thing that you typically need is a gift letter. If they're gifting you these funds to help you with equity injection, you just need a quick explanation, very simple, why they're giving you this money, why they're helping you. And yeah, as it mentions here, there could be a sharing a small portion of the business for that equity investment, or it could be just a gift. So it is certainly allowable.
Great, but it can't be a loan.
It cannot be a loan. I mean, the SBA has some rules against borrowed funds for equity injection. Now, again, you can use, I know you have home equity loan or, HELOC, essentially home equity line of credit that people often use. And while that is allowable, it's not always the most preferred route from lenders. Two things. I mean, again, you are borrowing, essentially borrowing against your real estate asset. And adding a small layer of debt to be able to come up with your equity injection. And the other thing it does is it, of course, pulls equity out of your available collateral. And when we talk about, goodwill transactions where there's no real estate involved, most lenders want to see if it's a risk mitigant, you having some equity in your real estate. Well, you don't want to be shrinking that or removing that or taking that away from the opportunity. So, that's just something I wanted to mention on the potential as folks think about pulling money out of their home to come up with a down payment.
Great. Good. Thank you very much. And Suzanne, let's take a look at the next slide then.
Yeah, I have a couple of points. First, if you are not involving the SBA, you can borrow all the money you want from family and friends. So that's one point. And if you do want to learn more about ROBS, contact us, please, and we'll put you in touch with some good companies that we've had success with.
Great. So the second leg of the stool is the bank financing. So you can borrow from a commercial bank. We see it from time to time. But the thing to remember with a commercial bank is that they're looking at asset-based. They want to have assets or collateral that they're going to lend the money against. And as we've been talking about businesses, significant number of small businesses are goodwill. And so a commercial bank is not going to loan against the goodwill, which is the wonderful thing why the Small Business Administration exists. They talk about small business being the engine of America, the number of businesses that are out there. Obviously, there's going to be a certain number of businesses, a significant number, bought and sold every year. And if there was only commercial bank lending available, or you had to have all the money that it took to buy a business, there would be no business transactions. So the SBA is really the vehicle by which most small business transactions are going to happen. Now, the SBA doesn't loan the money. The money is loaned by a commercial lending institution. The SBA is guaranteeing that loan. And Renee, really quickly, can you just jump in and kind of give that framework of the SBA guarantee and how you each participate?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Don. There are thousands of SBA lenders across the country, especially here in the Front Range. We have hundreds of lenders that offer SBA loans. So typically, the SBA will allow banks to finance up to 90% of the transaction. And we can look at the cash flow. We can look at repayment over 10 years, where a commercial loan is going to look at the assets. They're probably going to do a term of maybe 1, 3, or 5 years. The SBA provides the framework to allow financing for up to 10 years to finance that small business. The SBA does provide each bank that participates, there is a guarantee. These loans are guaranteed 75% by the federal government.
Great. Great. And so with that guarantee, the lenders are prepared to step up. Now, something that Renee didn't mention, but it's very, very important that they maintain a solid portfolio of their loans. They have to follow a lot of policies. They have to stay within the SBA guidelines. But assuming they do that and assuming they make good choices, they're going to be well backed by the SBA on their loans. So that's how that works. She also mentioned there's hundreds of SBA lenders, and there are. I'm just going to suggest to anyone, if you're going to look for an SBA loan, don't just walk to the corner bank and ask them about it. Make sure you're going to a preferred lender with experience, and we'd be happy to help guide you to those. The difference between a bank that has done hundreds and hundreds of SBA loans with a trained staff and those where the person at the local branch takes your application and then passes it off to somebody who passes it off to somebody, you can just get into a kind of a black hole on that. So please make sure you're looking for an SBA preferred lender.
That's a great
program. I mentioned it briefly the other day. One is a 7A. That's what allows a business to be purchased. One's a 504. That allows real estate to be purchased, more years associated with that. But when business and real estate are being sold together, we talked about that, it sometimes happens, then you can get into a blended business and real estate where you can actually stretch out the length of time that the business is being paid for, more like what you're doing with the real estate. And there are different rates. I think, Renee, if I'm not mistaken, your real estate rates are going to be lower than your business rates.
That is correct. I mean, that's going to be across the board. So whenever you have when there's a real estate component, the rate is, because of having that real estate fixed asset as part of the financing transaction, the interest rate is going to be a little bit different than if it was just a straight business asset loan. And when you talk about the differences with the 7A program, the 504 program, or if you can blend it, you definitely want to have that conversation early, because sometimes there is a great advantage to the small business to keep the business asset acquisition on a 10-year loan under the 7A, and then use the 504 loan program to have that the real estate piece amortized over 20 to 25 years. We are seeing historic rates right now for the 7A and 504 loan program. The rate for the 504 loan program for their piece of the financing is less than 3% currently.
Yeah, I just, those numbers are just astounding to me.
It's definitely a very interesting time. I've had the pleasure of financing SBA loans for 20 years, and these are the lowest rates we've seen. And clients are asking, how can this be? How are these true? Is this correct? And, everybody is certainly shocked, but the 504 loan program certainly they want to retain and create jobs.
Yeah. And if you put, if you look at the difference between getting that 3% rate that Renee's talking about and a more traditional 6 or 7% rate, and Renee, I know you've seen even higher, that just changes the cost of owning that business significantly.
Certainly.
for the better.
For
So-
absolutely for the better. And I
Yeah.
think it's always great for everybody to ask about both programs if real estate is involved, so you can see what's going to be most beneficial to you in the business as you move forward.
Great. Okay, let's keep moving here. There are SBA requirements. I talked about these briefly. Not every business is going to qualify. As brokers, a lot of times what we'll do is when a seller wants the list, before we even get the business on the market, we're going to take that business to multiple SBA lenders and say, hey, this is what we've got going on here. Is this going to qualify for an SBA loan? And would you be a lender who's willing to participate in that? And that can be tremendously valuable to know that up front, know that either you're going to run into obstacles or it will be financed. But here's some of the things that really needs to be looked at. Number one, they're going to be looking at the history of the business. How long has it been there? And they're certainly looking for a minimum of 2 to 3 years, and preferably being in business for 5, because you really have to establish some duration to show the continuity of the earnings, the trends associated with that, and to be able to know how transferable that's going to be. In addition to the books in the history of the business with the P&L, the balance sheet, they're going to want business tax returns. Joe, I think for an SBA loan, does it require at least 2 years of tax returns?
You need 2 years of entity establishment, which essentially leads into or coincides with having 2 years of tax returns. But you need essentially 2 years in business.
Okay, very good. Profits and loss statements.
Do those tax returns both have to support the business price, or can only one?
Well, at that point, it really depends on the lender. I mean, we like to call them single year cash flow deals or opportunities. And I'm sure Renee can speak to this as well. I mean, it's not going to be for every bank, but some banks, again, dependent on the growth, the industry, that bank's appetite to lend to that type of business, your borrower, all of that is going to come into play. And then sometimes you can get a bank comfortable with only a single year of historical income on a tax return that supports, the valuation or the asking price. And same can be said for the, for the business valuation that would be to follow as part of the process.
Thank you.
Great. So we talk about what are lenders looking for here. Lenders are calculating using these financial documents to calculate the cash flow, because what they say is, the business has to pay for the primary things that it's going to support. What are those? Number one, there has to be enough profit in that business to support the loan repayment. The buyer is also going to likely have some lifestyle expenses. I'll give you an example of when they don't. If there is a working spouse making a significant amount of money, and this is a small purchase of a boutique jewelry store or little retail store, maybe the owner is not going to need to take a lot of money out of the business for lifestyle because there's other money available to support the family. But if in fact this is for the wage earner who is supporting that family, that it's got to support repayment, it's got to support the buyer's lifestyle expenses, which includes taxes, because taxes are going to have to be paid on the profits of the business. And there's got to be a little money left over for a potential reinvestment back into the business. So, that's what the lenders are going to be looking at. Can it support all of those things?
And Don, can I just clarify something on that point when you mentioned the spouse? When you're looking to buy a business, and I know more often than not, your thoughts are, well, this business is going to be my new source of income. And you may not have outside income, or you may not have a day job, or you may be quitting your day job. And yes, businesses or banks are going to look at that cash flow. They're going to look at your global cash flow. The only way the bank can realistically consider spousal income and the ability for that income or the use of that income to cover your lifestyle or your household expenses is if your spouse is also willing to personally guarantee the loan. If the spouse does not want to, or whether they're involved in this new business venture or not, but if they're not willing to personally guarantee the loan, or that's not what you had in mind, then the bank can't consider or utilize their income to be considering covering the household expenses, and thus it may be a little bit detrimental to the cash flow if they need to build a salary in for you. Does that make sense? Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Great additional detail, Joe. Appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to throw in one other thought. It's, when you go to buy a piece of real estate, you go to your lender and you get pre-qualified, and I can buy a house that costs this much money. All buyers cannot buy the same business. So if the buyer doesn't have the background, the lenders aren't going to lend to them. So the buyer has to sell themselves to the lender. And as well, the same buyers might not be able to get the same loan, or different buyers might not be able to get the same loan. If one buyer has 3 kids in Ivy League colleges and the other has the spouse with the great income signing on the loan, those loan amounts can be very different.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And we've got a point here. It says buyer experience and qualifications important, not only on the financial side, but also in terms of their attributes, what they bring to the table to run it. I think there's an important part of anytime I see a buyer go to an SBA lender, they always come back to me and say, oh man, I got to do a business plan. The SBA lender is asking for a business plan. And that's really where the SBA lender is saying, demonstrate to us in advance of giving you this loan, whether you can understand what it's going to take to run this business, and show us what you're going to do and what you think the future of the business can be, given your contributions to it. And how seriously do you take the business plan, Joe?
Again, it definitely depends on the lender. The SBA themselves have, in the past years, I've noticed there's been kind of a loosening of this quote business plan requirement. I have some banks that have it on a 1-page form. I have some that want to see a 3 to 4 or 5-page, really detailed understanding of the existing business, your plans as new owner, your background, yada yada yada. Again, it really depends on the lender, but for the most part, your business plan, no matter whom you're working with or which bank, in accordance with what the SBA needs or is filing away, is going to cover those standard bases. Is it existing business, changes that'll be made, good, bad, other, your qualifications, certain things that you would want to kind of spell out if you had the opportunity to sit down with a banker and they were to interview you and say, why are you qualified to purchase this business and what are your plans with it?
Great. Thank you. And the next item there, we're also talking about excellent buyer credit. We all see the TV ads all the time. Now you get your credit boost score. You can pay money and they take you from 630 to 680 or that kind of thing. Renee, how do you look at buyer credit? Are there any firm numbers that you sort of judge by?
We're gonna take a look at the credit report, and there's no hard and fast numbers to say, oh, your score needs to be X. But I can tell you that if there are recent credit challenges, that would be difficult. If there are recent bankruptcies, foreclosures, short sales, late payments, lenders are going to have a challenging time with that. I do encourage everybody, to Suzanne's point, to start talking to lenders early in the process, even before you've identified a business that you may want to purchase. I think it's very beneficial to start building a relationship with some lenders, to talk to them about what type of experience would you be looking for. There are some lenders that are going to say, if you're looking to buy a plumbing business, you need to have a plumbing license. or you're buying a restaurant, you need to have a restaurant background. I think it's important for everyone to know what each lender's appetite is, what the credit appetite looks like, and to have those conversations early.
Great.
There's not going to be a hard and fast number that you're going to see advertised out there on what someone's credit should be.
And Renee, don't think that you can hide anything from a lender, right? It's all going to show up.
No, yes, we will. Lenders, we have once we pull the credit report, we do see everything for that time period. So we certainly, I always tell everybody, disclose everything. It's better to talk about it up front and see if it's going to be a challenge than to find out 40 days into the process.
Absolutely.
Great. Okay, we'll keep moving here. We still have a lot of content. So you will be required as a buyer to do a personal guarantee. If there is more than one person who's a buyer, anyone who has a 20% or more ownership interest will have to do a personal guarantee. We see a lot of deals where there's somebody else bringing money to the table, but they limit it to a 19% interest so that that person does not have to do a personal guarantee. And this is an interesting one. If you do own a home with a certain amount of equity, or if you have other personal assets, you may have to collateralize those. But the SBA doesn't penalize you. You're not penalized for being an apartment liver rather than a homeowner, or for not having assets. It's just that if you do have them, then they'll have to be collateralized. So they don't punish people for not having those things, which I think is great. It's going to allow a lot more people to get involved in buying businesses. All right.
Can I throw in, there's a huge psychology to collateralizing a home. And it may be more psychology than reality, but we've lost many deals when the spouse would not agree to the home collateralization. So find that out up front.
Good point.
Yeah, and just one more addition to that one, Don. And I always like to make this very clear with potential borrowers. Yes, if you have more than 20% equity in any of your real estate, your personal residence, investment real estate that you own, all of it's going to be on the line. As you said, you're not penalized if you don't have enough equity to fully collateralize a loan, but the SBA requires the lender to look to every single piece of real estate you own where there is significant equity until the point that the loan is fully collateralized by your real estate. And if you have excess equity in your real estate, yes, you can pick and choose which real estate you want to allow the bank to utilize. And it would be at an 85% liquidation value. So whatever equity there is, 85% of that would then cover, or be used towards covering or collateralizing your loan. But just want to add a little bit more detail to that point, because it's always really important for people to understand what they're going to have to put on the line when it comes to getting a loan where there's, again, no tangible assets involved in the opportunity.
Great. Perfect.
One more point, sellers, don't fall asleep here, because this is really important to you. Because if you want cash or almost all cash from your business, you're going to have to position your business to be SBA financeable.
Right. Very good. And that goes to the quality of the record keeping and the numbers themselves. So that ability to document exactly how that business works financially and cash flows and historicals, that's all the big part of it. That's on the seller, not on the buyer. Okay, so we have a purchase scenario here of a business acquisition. The slide that's up now, I think, is showing you at the top the loan structure. Down at the bottom is the loan detail. This is $1 million purchase price. I think, Suzanne, we have sort of larger. And for those of you, if you have a workbook or anything, some of these are in the back as well. But let's dissect this individual deal. Suzanne, you got something?
Do you not see it?
Oh, I see it. No, I do see it.
Okay.
So the business acquisition price, $1 million. As we talked about yesterday, in addition to the $1 million, it's going to take 100,000 in working capital. One of the reasons that working capital is in the deal with the business acquisition price is, buyers are often trying to buy the most expensive business that they can buy. And so they work hard to make sure they have their down payment together. They don't necessarily have all that extra cash for working capital. They're often going to need to have that brought to the deal in terms of financing as well. So in this particular case, there's 100,000 in working capital required to operate the business. The loan itself is going to have a fee of 2%, so $20,000 on the 1 million. There's a loan closing cost that's going to include the appraisal of the business and other fees that go with that, $3,500, and an SBA packaging fee. So we use the term project. That's the price of the business plus these other components come together. That's called the total project cost of $1,125,000. So that's the amount of money that has to be available from the buyer to make this transaction happen, or through the three legs of the stool. Well, it turns out in this particular case, the seller is going to carry 10% of the sales price, which is more like 9% of the project, but 10% of the sales price. So 100,000. So there's $1,025,000 that has to be dealt with either from the lender or the buyer, because the seller's portion has been taken care of. SBA in this case is saying we can do an 80% loan. You'll notice that's 80% of the remaining amount of money. That's $820,000, which means the borrower is bringing to the table $205,000. So this deal gets put together with 100,000 seller carry, 820,000 seller note, and 205,000 from the borrower, from the buyer. So let's keep in mind that 205,000. Let's look at the loan itself just for a second, see how this works. It's a 10-year fully amortized loan. I think Joe and Renee, I think 10 years is what we most commonly see. There are people doing other rates, but that's what we most commonly see. And we did this off a 5.25% rate. But as you heard earlier, we're seeing rates in the 3s and 4s. So there are some very, very good rates out there for businesses. But for way of example, we use 5.25. What that means is there's going to be a loan payment every month of roughly $8,800. That's for the SBA portion. The seller's loan of $100,000 is going to also be at the same rate, but only for 5 years. So that payment is going to be about $1,900 a month. So if you add those two together, the buyer is paying $10,700 for the first 5 years, and $10,700 times 12 months is $128,000 and change. So that's the annual payments that are being made. Now, some things that happen, and it starts to get a little tricky when you get in here, is number one, the seller carry. Oftentimes, the SBA lender is saying, we want to make sure that this business gets off the ground well. We don't want to unduly put the business at stress with these loan repayments. We're going to ask the seller to wait 1 year before they start getting payments. I've even seen wait 2 years before they start getting payments. That's a way to keep the debt load down in the early years for the buyer, and the seller could be asked to do that. That request is going to come from the SBA lender. And then the other one is, again, to keep the payments low, they may look for an interest-only structure for the first few years, possibly with a balloon or some change in the debt structure afterwards. But So those are things sellers should be aware of. That's the money that you have loaned to the buyer to make this acquisition happen. The other thing to say is, as a seller note, you are in second position, meaning your loan is subordinated to the SBA. The SBA is going to make sure they get their payments first. When they receive their payments, then you can get yours. Okay, so what's the reality check here? We went through a calculation of this business. We said, yep, it makes 400,000 SDE. 128,000 of that is going to come off the top to make the loan payments. So that's going to leave that $271,636. That's for that lifestyle that we talked about. That's for paying the taxes of the business. That's for reinvesting back into the business, and that's for profits. And so 271,000 is left. And down payment was 205. So a buyer of this business came up with $205,000 of their own money, and they're receiving 271,000 in cash flow every year for that $205,000 they came up with. Looking back at that chart of the return on your investment, there is an example of a significant return based on the down payment that was made. Now, you took on some obligations and liabilities for loans, but those are all factored in that annual debt payment. What else did you acquire with your down payment? Well, if you remember, we looked at that business. There was $250,000 in furniture, fixtures, and equipment, $150,000 in inventory, $50,000 in leasehold improvements, and $100,000 working capital went into this deal. So for $205,000, you actually got $550,000 worth of assets or your down payment purchasing power. So you can see on a reality check, it's not negative. It can be very positive. And this is a really good way for buyers to look at any acquisition they're doing. What am I getting for my money? In addition to the business itself, looking at it from this financial perspective can be very powerful. Okay.
Right. If a buyer decided to start this business, they'd have to come up with that 550,000, and then they still would have no business.
Absolutely. This is a business that has customers. It has, daily operations. It has trained employees. It has a location that's been built out. It's all right there. It starts on day one working for you. Whereas taking the idea of I'm going to start this business from scratch means all of these other investments fall to you. And so they can be significant. This is the power of leveraging an SBA loan, which, you may not be able to get the same kind of a loan to get a business started as you can for one that's operational. So I think we've been covering this all the way through our discussion, but just to sum up some of these things, you're going to get the leverage for bringing 20%. There's 80% that you're going to be able to leverage in the form of a loan. And so just so you know, a seller note is actually considered an equity injection in the business. And so because it's subordinated to the SBA loan, it's considered an equity injection. So both the buyer's down payment and the seller note will be considered equity. You will have to have cash reserves. The SBA lender is going to say, is there money if things get tight, if things go bad? Are you sitting on the edge, or do you have some reserves, some cushion there? And that'll be really important. But as we showed you on the last slide, that down payment of $205,000 is going to get immediate cash flow of $271 after repaying the loans. And to the benefit of the seller, they're getting 90% in cash at closing and carrying 10%.
And I can't say enough, cash speaks. I mean, if you've got a buyer that wants to put 50% down, seller's note would be in first position, but in this case, the seller gets 90% down. Most sellers choose this that I've seen.
Yep, absolutely. I call it the 99% club, and that's sellers who walk into our office and say they don't want to take a seller note when they get started. But it's about a 50% club when the deals get done. And but taking a small seller note when there's a solid SBA loan so that you get majority cash at closing is definitely the way to go. You know, we'll go a long time before we come across buyers who simply buy businesses with their own pocket money. It just doesn't happen very often. Okay, when the seller carries a note, why do you have to do it? Number one, the bank or the SBA financing simply may not be available. It could be the business is not doing very well. There could be a number of reasons, but if the bank, the SBA financing can't be made available, it either has to be all cash from the buyer or the seller loaning money to the buyer to make that transaction happen.
Can I bring up a point, Don? SBA
Absolutely.
financing is not always available. When people are wanting to sell, you only know what you have today. I mean, 3 months of this year, I would say SBA financing was not available. Back in 2009, I had a business that had SDE of 500,000 on the tax return, 3 years running. There was not lending then. They wanted to lend $20,000 on this business that was worth $1.5 million, which was half of the liquidation value of the assets. It was a software company. There was not SBA lending then. You only know what you know right now, is my point.
Suzanne, Suzanne, can I add something to that?
Yeah, please.
Great, thanks. I also wanted to mention, I've had some conversations this year with clients that wanted to buy a business, and unfortunately, like Suzanne said, there were some opportunities that were not going to get financing. A great thing to talk about early on is, let's say the business isn't eligible today for bank financing or SBA financing. If the seller were to carry a short-term note, the buyer comes in, the buyer is making payments to the seller for a period of at minimum 2 years. At that point in time, the buyer will have 2 years of tax returns and 2 years of running that business. They can go to a lender in as little as 2 years to see if they can refinance the seller note. And then the seller gets all of their funds a couple of years later when the financials look a little bit better and the economic environment might be a little bit better.
Yep. I think Wells did that for us this year on a deal.
Yeah, we're seeing that on a number of deals. I have several buyers who fully intend to just cash out the seller note and refinance the SBA. Good. Okay. Other times, sometimes seller note is a way to get the price you want. If you're willing to finance it as a seller, you may have a buyer who's willing to give you a little more money for the business than they might otherwise have been able to do. Seller note can allow you to defer your taxes. You're not going to be paying taxes on money you have not yet received. And so you can push that off into the future. Think as a seller, think about the year that you close a business, you get a significant amount of cash. It could mean that you're in a much higher tax bracket. So by moving that money off into a year when you're in a lower tax bracket, that can be very advantageous. No application fees or loan fees to the buyer. I mean, that's an advantage to the buyer that the seller can create because they don't have to go through the expenses of getting the SBA or other commercial loan. Less paperwork. There's a promissory note that's created for paperwork that's usually drawn up by the closing attorney for the transaction. It's a legal document. It's very thorough, but it's almost a template document that's pretty easy to generate. It's not complicated. Seller notes tend to be shorter than SBA loans. We talked about 5 years. Sometimes I'll see a seller note, if it's really a significant part of the deal, have to go out to 6, 7 years. But typically it's shorter than an SBA loan. Sometimes they're as short as 3 or 4 years. 2 to 5 year term, again, shorter. And we talked about this, they are subordinate to an SBA loan. If there is also an SBA loan, just keep in mind that the SBA payments must be made first. And I'll even bring up one slightly more challenging component to that, and that is the SBA is going to review on some regular basis the financials of the business. If they feel that the financials are shrinking, it's getting tighter, maybe more difficult for that new owner to pay off their SBA loan, they can cause a seller note to be paused in repayments. Renee, do you have any comments on that?
That's a lender by lender is going to have a different opinion on that. There are some SBA lenders that, as long as you're making payments as agreed, there's no covenants. There are also some lenders where they do put in covenants to certain debt service expectations, and they could call the note. I can tell you that the institution that I work for, we do not have any covenants in place like that. As long as payments are being made agreed, we're not going to look at the seller note. But every bank looks at something different. But I can tell you that if a client were to call me a couple of years into it and say, we are in some trouble, we're looking for a deferral or a rate modification, at that point, we would collect information. And if they're going to go on a note deferral, there may be some discussion at that point, but there's not going to be anything in their loan agreement that speaks to that specifically.
Great. Good addition there. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's move on.
Not moving on. There. Okay.
Deal structure. Okay, so we've talked about the seller note. Everything is, you start with a price, but the deal is put together. It's put together with the sources of funding, and then it's all got to be looked at. So the seller can influence how this deal is going to be put together. Number one, they're going to be able to have more SBA contribution, likely if they have clean books and records, if the business is well managed and is very transferable in terms of, we talked about customer mix and all these other influencers, and minimal reliance on seller. We always say, make yourselves dispensable, seller. If the business relies on you, how do you expect somebody else to take over, pay you the value of that business, and continue to run it? It was dependent upon you. So we always say, try and take a 6-week vacation before you sell it, or do something to prove that the business is going to run just fine without you. Because if it does, if you are the backbone of the business and only you, excuse me, that's going to make it very difficult to get top value for the business, or even to have a loan be possible. Seller carry comforts, buyer and a lender. Why is a seller carry involved in there? Well, it's a statement. If you're willing to take some risk, it's a statement that you're comfortable with the person who's buying this business and that it can be transferable. And that gives everybody some confidence. That's the skin in the game side. It also is going to reduce the amount of money potentially that the SBA needs to bring in, and that money is subordinate. Your loan is subordinate. So they're going to feel reduced risk from that. And then there's also the possibility of doing a note offset or an escrow holdback. And that's another way in the deal structure to move some of the risk to a different point. And Suzanne, do you want to just describe specifically what you're looking at on that one?
As I said before, even if it's an all cash deal, rarely does the seller get all cash the closing day. The buyer wants to make sure that the seller does their transition with them. There are a few things that follow a sale: sales taxes, payroll taxes, personal property taxes, vendor relationships may not transfer. So buyers are going to structure something where they can either offset the note or they'll have money in escrow for some period of time until they're ensured that all these things happened.
Great. Tax management is another reason to structure a deal a certain way. We talked about the ability to defer or change taxes. Suzanne's going to talk, I think, in more detail in a minute. Maybe it's on one of my slides about how deals are allocated, and that allocation of funds is going to affect your taxation. And there's a whole lot of deals that you start off at point A, but by the time the buyer who's really committed and really wants the deal, and the seller's really wants to sell and likes the buyer, and everybody's happy, but there can be a lot of creative structures that have to be created to get over the individual hurdles, the individual challenges that any particular set of circumstances might put in. And so it's a point in the deal where everybody needs to put on their thinking cap and say, how are we going to solve this problem? How are we going to solve this problem and put the deal together? Okay.
Any questions? We must be so thorough and
we try.
Okay, moving on. Okay, what's purchase financing looking like in the time of COVID? And this means deals that are not SBA financeable. And quite frankly, these same strategies can be applied in any case. So where to start for businesses that have been impacted by COVID? We decided that let's let the seller get a chance to sell at the pre-COVID price, the 2019 valuation. And that in every case is assuming that the seller can hang in there. We think that the multiples should not vary so much in that price is equal to earnings times multiple. It's the earnings that might be different. And again, can the business rebound to justify the pre-COVID-19 value, deal structure reflecting it? So that the spa we were talking about, let's be optimistic and say that they can be back up and running at full capacity next summer or fall. There's a possibility of that. We might do a deal structure wherein there are no payments until the business has had a chance to rebound, get on its feet again. So we might defer the payments for a year. The buyer might have a note wherein in years 2 and 3 and 4, if the business hasn't come back, the note might be reduced. So let's look at some of these strategies. Anyway, before we look at those, I guess we're going to still talk about the banks. As we talked about, SBA is back in action. They were not for a while, and we were terrified. They might be working off of projections. There's been both higher levels of scrutiny on the business and the buyer. The experience was important. The cash reserves had to be greater than they used to have to be. Don, you're the expert on this. PPP loans. A lot of our sellers got PPP loans, and we had some real trouble with those for a while. Could we sell a business with a PPP loan? Did the seller have to pay it off? Could they not be forgiven? At least we have guidance in place now, and we are selling businesses and loans are being forgiven.
Yeah, it was,
Want to show you?
the numbers could be pretty large. I had a business that had a $305,000 PPP loan with no guidance at the time we were trying to work the deal as to whether or not the business could be sold and the PPP loan still be forgiven. So anytime you're going to have a $305,000 open-ended swing, the parties are not going to be very interested in moving forward. And it was almost impossible to get a clear answer. We had lenders who took very conservative positions and just said, we don't really want to get involved in that because we don't know what we're going to be able to do. And we had other lenders and also attorneys who said, oh, go ahead and do it. It'll be fine. But who wanted to take the risk? Nobody. We just had a lot of opinions and no facts.
Yeah. In the consideration of time, I'm going to move on the next couple slides. Bottom line, we believe that with COVID impacted businesses, the sellers will become the lenders. And here's some ways to do that that don't require cash out of the buyer's pocket. Adjustable seller, debt and lease assumptions, and earnouts. So let's go through all of these. What is a promissory note? We've talked about it. It's a loan from the seller to the buyer, in this case on the business. The amount, terms, conditions, collateral, and recourse are all defined. They're usually personally guaranteed by the buyer in small business sales. Larger business sales, if there's a large corporation buying a business or there's a note, typically there's not an individual that signs. But in small businesses, expect to sign on notes, expect to sign on leases. Outside collateral might come into play. Just like the SBA asks for a house as collateral, a seller can do that as well. So earnouts, these are when all or part of the business price is determined by the future sales, gross profit, or net income on the business. Please don't do it on the net income. That's so hard to define what that is. Best is to do it on the top line sales, but I'll give you a case where this really came into effect. I had a business for sale, was a snack food manufacturer. And the poor seller had the perfect storm of things happen to her. She got a divorce, the recession came, and she got sick with cancer. She had to sell the business. She needed more money than the offers were coming in at. So I said, well, we have to do something to get that business to be worth more in the buyer's eyes. So she said, okay, I will go. She bought plane tickets to 17 cities. She traveled to all of them. She drummed up business. Fortunately, as a snack food manufacturer, she had what was called a co-packer who could produce unlimited products. So all she had to do was sell. She got these 17 accounts. The business started to come in, but we didn't know how much it was going to. So we agreed the business as it was, the historic business was worth a certain value, and the buyer agreed to pay that. And then the buyer agreed to pay 10% of all the new business for 3 years that she generated so that she could get value out of that and get more money. And it worked beautifully. There can be a cap on that, or there can be a time limit, or you can say, as soon as you hit $500,000 in this earnout, it's done. SBA people, you don't like them. SBA does not allow them. In certain cases, they're really valid. The other time they're really valid is when you're not sure if the business is going to transfer because of the relationship with the seller or something like that. So this is a useful tool in certain cases. Questions on that?
Suzanne, this is Doug. Real quick question on the earnout. Is earnout usually only if the seller is going to remain relatively actively involved in the business, or do you have situations where there would be an earnout, but the seller may not be maintaining some type of involvement?
Good question, Doug. It's both. If the seller stays, they can often influence that. we had a sale recently that the seller wanted to stay on and develop part of the business that they never had the time to. We agreed to do that via an earnout, and they stayed involved. But on the other hand, like with the snack food manufacturer, the seller set up everything into place, and it was, the groundwork was laid. So they don't have to.
And do you see,
Depends on the situation.
no, that makes sense. Do you see, I'm assuming as well from an earnout is it usually like less than 50% of the total value of the business, or is there kind of a standard percentage that you might see for earnouts?
It needs to make sense is what I'll say. And we used to have a chart that showed if you're doing it off of the sales, it should be this. If you're doing it off of the gross profit, if you're doing it off of the net profit, that's what you get to, how you get to the same place. But it needs to, the buyer needs to be incentivized. It can't be that there's no profit for the buyer out of it, and therefore they're not going to work hard to realize that. They've got to be incentivized, and the seller does too. It's a work of art to create one.
That makes sense.
Okay, so since the SBA does not allow earnouts, here's how you get around that sometimes. It's called a forgivable promissory note, or earn down, or clawback note, or reduction note. The terminology can be any of all of those. It can be all or part of the price. And in this case, the buyer would have a promissory note with the seller, but let's say it expected the sales to hit $1 million. And if the sales hit $1 million, the buyer paid it. If it only hit 900,000, the buyer would pay less. And it depends on the metrics that you define, or future revenues or other metrics. So the difference between an earnout and this, the price can only go down on the adjustable seller note, whereas in the earnout, the price can go up. This is one way to structure a creative deal. Okay, AR and AP assumptions. So as you heard, the way we are valuing businesses, the working capital is outside of the business price, and it adjusts the price up or down at the end. In this case, this is a financing mechanism. The buyer can take possession of the AR and give the cash to gives cash to the seller, which means the price would be increased. And they can also assume the liability of the AP, which means they'd bring less cash to closing. This is with or without creditor approval. Talk to your attorney if you're going to do this. We kind of put this in place as a desperation move for COVID times, but it's happened other times. You can also assume debt or leases on bank loans, vehicle loans, equipment leases, with or without lender approval. Again, talk to the attorney. So last year, this had nothing to do with COVID, but a seller came to us and he wanted out of his business badly, and he wanted to sell it to a key employee. Well, his key employee had $10,000. So lenders, you wouldn't, and the business was worth about 300,000. So lenders, you weren't going to do anything on that, right? You're not going to work with this guy probably. He had no cash reserves, nothing. So what we did, first thing we did was we took the receivables of the business. They were about 80,000. So we gave the receivables to the buyer. So the price became $380,000. Then this business had leases on 3 very large pieces of equipment. Those leases had a value of about $60,000. So there was $60,000 of quote unquote down payment the buyer didn't have to come up with. He just had to pay the equipment leases. Then we had a promissory note, and we extended this promissory note out far enough that the payments made sense, that this buyer could make the payments on the business and continue to operate. The seller, we normally wouldn't have done a deal that was that tight with the buyer that tight, but the seller wanted to do it. It's been a year and a half now. I've not heard of any problems. I think everybody's happy. It worked. They found ways to get money into the buyer's pocket without it being cash. All good? Okay, here comes the fun part, the purchase price allocation. So as you recall, early yesterday, I said in asset sales, the seller does not know what their taxes are going to be until they negotiate it with the buyer. This is required in asset sales. It is not done in stock sales. So the IRS has defined asset classes, and there's a form 8594, which we have as a closing document. I'm going to show you one that breaks it out. It determines the seller's taxes and the buyer's beginning balance sheet, and they have to match. The IRS checks that they match. So here are some likely allocation categories. Furniture, fixtures, and equipment, FF&E. We talked about that. Inventory at cost, or WIP ad plays into that. Leasehold improvements, those are the tangible ones. Then there's a bunch of intangibles. Franchise rights, familiarization and training, consulting, a covenant not to compete, business trade name, and goodwill. Those last 5 categories are all intangibles, but those are where you might put this allocation. One note, Colorado is one of 2 states that require a sales tax on furniture, fixtures, and equipment at the time of the sale. So if you have $100,000 worth of equipment and the buyer buys it, it's just like the buyer buying it from a store or whatever. They pay a tax of 8 point whatever %, whatever your local sales tax is on it. Very close to closing time. So let's see what this looks like for our deal. Remember in the YSBA purchasing power we had? For this business, we decided that the furniture, fixtures, and equipment was worth $250,000. The inventory is worth $150,000. The seller had put $50,000 into the leasehold improvements. As you heard yesterday, he doesn't get to take them, but he got to pay it, and they're needed to run the business. We told you it was a franchise, so the seller put $50,000 toward the franchise when they bought the business. The seller and the buyer are agreeing $10,000 is the value of the training. They agreed that there's going to be a consulting agreement after closing of about $10,000. There's almost always a covenant not to compete in business sales. The buyer's buying the business and doesn't expect the seller to go and open up shop next door with the money that he gave them and take all the business away. So there are 3 elements to a covenant not to compete. It's the activity. What are you going to do? It's the time frame, and it's the geography of the non-compete. And these all need to be spelled out, and this can get pretty contentious. But it's very important. So we have a very small amount of money here, $10,000. Going to tell you why it's so low later. And then we've got business trade name and goodwill on the bottom with a huge amount of money toward it. All of these adding up to $1 million. So I'm going to show you why each category has what they have where they do. So for the seller's purposes, this is what it looks like tax-wise. Furniture, fixtures, and equipment, there's a lovely thing called depreciation recapture. So every year you get to write off a certain amount of depreciation on your taxes. And then lo and behold, when you sell the business, the IRS says, okay, now you got to recapture it and pay it back. So that's a problem. So most mature businesses have written off all of their assets. Accountants really want to depreciate everything as fast as they can. So There's usually very little book value. So the biggest negotiation in purchase price allocation is the value of the equipment, because it has the highest tax rate. This depreciation recapture becomes ordinary income. Inventory usually has no tax ramification to the seller unless they wrote it all off. In 2018, the IRS started allowing you to write off all of your inventory in one fell swoop. Well, that was great for that year, but guess what? You get to recapture it. So people that did that, they've got a bigger tax bill at the end. Leasehold improvements are like furniture, fixtures, and equipment, except a much longer depreciation period, but they're subject to depreciation recapture. The franchise rights are subject to amortization recapture. You get to amortize it, but then you got to reclaim it when you sell. The toughest categories are familiarization and trading and consulting, because those both become earned income, which means ordinary income with payroll taxes and the double hit of payroll taxes. So 15-something% on top of it. So quite often any money allocated to these categories is at about a 50% tax rate on a high income earning business. So painful. The covenant not to compete becomes ordinary income. And the lowest tax category, at least at this time, is business trade name and goodwill, long-term capital gains, which are very low right now. That it may change, but we know what we know today. So here's what happens on the tax implications for the buyer. When they load their balance sheet with that $250,000 of FF&E, they get to depreciate it over an average of about 3 to 7 years, depending upon the asset itself. The IRS determines that. Inventory, no cost, no write-off on that. It just goes on their balance sheet and they use it. Leasehold improvements are about 15 years write-off on average, and that's different accountants have different opinions. Franchise rights are usually a 15-year write-off amortization or the term. Accountants differ on this. I go with 15 years. Familiarization and training and consulting are both the term of those agreements. Most of the familiarization and training is done either the first year, or if you're selling a business right now, it would probably spill into next year too. You would write it off during that year or two. Consulting, it's over the term of it. Interesting to note, covenant not to compete and goodwill trade name are both 15-year write-offs for the buyer. They get to amortize those over 15 years. So the reason that we put so little into the non-compete and so much into the trade name and goodwill is for the buyer, it didn't matter. They got the same write-off. For the seller, markedly different tax implications, much lower on the business trade name and goodwill. Does that make sense to everybody? This is why you need an accountant when you do a business sale. Here's what our Form 8594 looks like, and here's a breakdown of it. There are 7 asset categories. Remember, we said our sale did not include any cash, so nothing got put there. No investment vehicles. The receivables did not go with it. In the case of the business I told you about, where the guy that had $10,000 down, he would have put down that he got $80,000 worth of accounts receivable here. Our business had 150 of inventory for class 4. Almost all of the tangible stuff except for inventory goes into class 5. FF&E, vehicles. If you have real estate in there, it goes in there. So we had the 250 in FF&E and the leasehold improvements of 50, coming up with 300,000. And then this is typical IRS. They put classes 6 and 7 together. So all the familiarization, consulting, covenant not to compete, goodwill, all go into it, except they have different tax rates. So then you have to break it out on another sheet. Anyway, these all need to add up to the price of the deal, which was $1 million. This is complicated. It's a lot. What I'm going to say is it really matters more in a deal, in most cases, for the seller to get an allocation that makes sense for them than for the buyer to do it. I have a favorite story. I call it my peanut butter sandwich story. We're all outdoorsy people here in Colorado. We like to hike. So you're going on a hike. You're going to go to a lake or to a summit. You got your peanut butter sandwich. You don't eat it all in the car. You eat it along the way. You enjoy it when you're sitting at the lake. But what accountants often want to do is have you eat the peanut butter sandwich in the car. They want all the write-offs as fast as you can get. I really strongly encourage buyers to work with sellers on giving them an allocation. The buyer gets the write-off. It's just when. But it doesn't make sense to take it the first year, which is usually not your best year. If you're planning on growing this business, save some of it for down the road, save it for the lake so that you can write it off later when you'll need those write-offs. Please call us if you have questions on this. That's the best thing to say at this point. I went through it pretty fast. Okay, what time are we at? Okay, got about 20 minutes. Okay.
So
Okay,
far,
Dawn. Somebody have a question?
no, it was just me saying we don't have any questions. There have been no questions in the chat.
Okay. Okay, well, good. Okay, Don, gonna let you take it from here on new normal thoughts.
Okay. Are there buyers? There's the question. There's the answer. In fact, you know, we're not just saying that. We actually right now have as active a buyer pool as I think we've ever had. Now, is there some skepticism? We'll talk about it about COVID, or there's some issues, yes. But interest rates are low and there's available people. So keep moving here, Suzanne. This is the kinds of things that we are seeing along with all of that significantly large buyer pool. Number one, they are looking for businesses that they're either pandemic proof or it's really easy to understand now that we have more information what the pathway through the pandemic environment will be so that the risk of the pandemic can be quantified. Some businesses will sell for low prices or little guaranteed money. Again, that's going to go to the risk presented by COVID. And so buyers are going to say, look, it's going to be 2 years before I can get back to what the finances used to be. I'm not going to pay you for what it used to be if for 2 years I'm going to be losing money. They're going to be looking for lower prices on that, or they're going to be looking to offset that, as Suzanne talked about, with escrows or earnouts or other things. Unemployment has increased. It has, and that is one of the things that's driving up our buyer pool. We'll often talk about, we call them the corporate refugees. In some cases, that comes from an unemployment move, like what's going on right now. An individual business may be trying to make some business changes. People with experience wind up outside of the corporate world, and they are looking for a path back into the economy, and business ownership is one of those. Hiring employees is a challenge. Yep. Every business we hear and every buyer comes in and says, but can I get employees? And the sellers are saying, well, I've had a tough time with it, but at least I've been able to keep the business going. Buyers will want to buy a job. That's a lot like the unemployment I just talked about. Sellers will want to sell. Sellers sell because something has changed, and sellers will need to sell. They've either reached retirement, or they have an illness, or a spouse is being relocated. All the traditional reasons they had to sell are still in place. Supply and demand factors are in effect. Absolutely. Absolutely. Right now, we have good buyers. We could use more businesses. So in some cases, we have more demand than we have supply, is what we're seeing out there. SBA will decide how to treat COVID-19 affected SDE. We talked about that a little bit earlier. How are these SBA lenders going to look at that? It's going to be very case by case, but it can factor in, or it might not be all that relevant for a particular business. Business rebound rate will be important. Yes. Is it going to be a year? Is it going to be 2? Is it going to be 3? The profile of a business and what industry it's in could determine whether it's one that bounces back easily or takes more time to rebuild. What else changed during the time the business was performing at a lower rate? And increased flexibility. Flexibility in buyers, flexibility in sellers, flexibility in deals, flexibility with landlords. We talked about that yesterday. There's just going to be a lot of things that it's going to take to put deals together. They're not going to be as straightforward as maybe some of our historical experiences have been.
Could I ask a question of the audience? For those of you that own businesses, are you having a hard time finding employees? I mean, it's interesting that I hear that people are.
This is Doug. We are tending to have a hard time finding employees with the right skill sets. Yes, there seems to be a lot of availability in the marketplace, but not for the skill sets we need.
Okay.
So yes.
I mean, for a while there, people didn't want to return to work, and there were some pretty attractive unemployment packages, but I didn't know how it settled out. So thank you, Doug. Anybody else have any input into that? Okay.
Time of opportunity, yes, it is. If your business is one of those, we say demand is stronger than supply right now. If you've got a solid business that's making it, there's going to be demand for that. Coupled with low loan rates, things are looking good for sellers. For distressed businesses, maybe a little less so. But again, it might be distressed, but can we see a rebound? Can we see what that path to a rebound is? There will be some situational opportunities. Absolutely. Absolutely. Circumstances, as Suzanne always says, was it your dad was in this business and he didn't buy businesses, he bought opportunities, right? And so that is exactly what we will see out in the market now. Buyers are calling us. They're telling us more specifically than ever what they're looking for, what kind of circumstances and situations they're looking for. So they're going to be moving in that space, but there are buyers. And the deal structure is going to reflect that economic risk. It also might reflect that seller's motivation. Seller might say, well, it'd probably be better for me to hang on for 2 years until we're back on track with the business, but I'm not motivated to stay in for 2 more years. So I'm prepared to put the business on the market at an adjusted price, adjusted value for that. So that's just what we're seeing. What are the buyers concerned about? They're concerned about the risk. They're concerned about whether or not they're going to be able to find the people to work in their businesses. One of the things that is going on is the opportunity, if you have an existing business, you can maybe bring a competitor in or some complementary business that extends your product line or extends your geography within the category you're already working on. We're seeing that happening, going on. Acquirers will only place value on what they can't replicate on their own. That really goes to, in many cases, a strategic acquisition. And that is that, there's that build or buy mentality. And if somebody thinks I can go in and do this organically, as opposed to pay you to take over your business, they're going to value that differential between their organic opportunity and the commercial opportunity. And, they may not be prepared to really stretch for that. And we're seeing that buyers have less cash or not be willing to spend as much cash. I'll tell you, when the market went from 29 to 20, that was a really strong statement. It's just back at 29. And so people's cash portfolios are going up, but they're also saying, if it were to go down, I could become cash strapped. I see how volatile it is. Maybe I need to hang on to some of that money. Maybe I'm not going to spend as much. So we're looking at deals that can be structured that the buyers bring a little less money to the table. And seller takeaway. We always, we frame this up maybe 10 different ways during the course of this program, but it's always the same message. And that is, sellers, you need to maximize the value of the business. You need to understand what it is you're going to transfer to a new owner. You need to maximize the amount of that transferable value. And that's what your business is going to be based on. And if the work hasn't been done to prepare for that, the buyers will recognize it and will treat the transaction accordingly, as they should. So really think about any sale that you've got going. Sellers, think about it, prepare for it, plan for it, and set it up to be worth the most it can possibly be worth, and to be ready to sell and make the transaction as smooth as it can possibly be. Don't put roadblocks in front of it. Okay, we have any questions? Otherwise, maybe is it a wrap up from Suzanne to follow?
It's a wrap up. I would like to say one thing. As opposed to, these much larger sales, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars sales, the size range we're talking about, money is not usually the driver in those sales. The sellers have another reason to move on from the business, positive or negative, but it's usually, they want the money, of course, and they want to get top dollar, but it's not just dangling a big check in front of them that makes them want to leave or be willing to sell out. Whereas in the larger businesses, that sometimes is the case. The sellers recognize, well, this is the most money I'm going to get, so let's do it now. But usually our sellers have a reason, personal reason. They feel a pain of something that they want to move on from their business. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up, and then maybe there will be questions. Okay, traditional buying factors. In any business, the top price is a buy versus build. So the buyer decides, can I get in there and do it on my own? If you're just buying a customer base, usually people in business already will choose to put money into advertising and salespeople. And sometimes those businesses are best bought by individuals. You should pay for a business based on how it's doing, but buy the business because of what you can do with it. So early yesterday, we had the story of the business Don had for sale, that it was a couple of retirement age. They were, just cruising along, kind of tired, and a young, energetic guy came in, and he paid for the business based on where it was, but he made a dramatic improvement, and someday he will be well rewarded when he sells. And in the meantime, he's being well rewarded because he's making a lot more money. So why should you buy a business? Well, the ramp up can be a lot faster than going out and putting the salespeople on the street. They say you can marry more money in 1 minute than you can make in a lifetime. Well, it's not quite that, but there's some truth to that. You can eliminate a competitor. see people buying businesses for that. As we showed you, it can be way easier to finance with leveraging and a loan that includes working capital for the right businesses. And you can make use of existing assets. Sometimes people are buying businesses to get a hold of their facility. We had a sale like that earlier this year. The business sold to a competitor. However, the selling business had twice the facility that the acquiring business had, and they were busting at the seams. They needed that facility. They needed those people. People are a real reason to buy businesses these days. Train people, just like Doug was telling us about. He could potentially consider buying a business that had the right kind of staff in it that he could add into his own. Getting into existing marketing channels can be huge. You probably all know Udi's bread and other products. Well, many years ago, Udi bought a small wholesale sandwich company from us. He didn't really care about the sandwiches. What Udi wanted was King Soopers shelf space. Udi couldn't get in on his own. He did that, and the rest is history. He did very, very well. So value enhancements. If you are wanting to sell your business, I mean, money, increasing the profitability is always first and foremost. Money talks. Reduce the reliance on the owner. As Don said, go take that 6-week vacation if you can. I had a business for sale a couple of years ago. The seller took a year vacation, went all around the world, proved that his business could be run without him. Systemize and document so it's not all in your head, that a buyer can figure out what's going on without you. Jump up and down professionally prepared books. That is an investment that pays off. And clean books, no cash under the table, not so many discretionary expenses, etc. Try to have customer and product diversity. Buyers like that. Get contracts when possible. And I already said it, but no unreported income. Okay, the sun still rises every day. The laws of physics and business valuation prevail. We are going to find our way to a new normal. It's not going to be the same world it used to be, but there'll be both pluses and minuses. There will be opportunities. So please call us to talk about your unique situation. We can help answer any of these questions for you. What's my business worth? Should I buy or build? How can I get financing? Okay, does anybody have any questions or follow-up statements?
Last minute questions. Hearing none?
Okay, well,
All right.
well, thank you so much, Amira. Thank you, Don. Thank you, Joe and Renee.
Yeah,
Really appreciate everyone.
Definitely want to thank the audience. I want to thank Joe and Renee. Over the last 2 days, we really threw a lot at you guys, and you came back with great answers. Very helpful. So thank you on that.
Absolutely.
Thank you to Front Range Business and all that participated.
Amira,
I will send an post email with both of the video links in it and everybody's contact info. So
are you
just
going
make
to
it.
do a valuation or a questionnaire?
I hadn't prepared anything.
Okay. Well,
But
if
you can
have,
feel free, when I send the post email, you can feel free to add any comments or share anything that you'd like us to know just by using the reply all.
yeah, please let us know what you thought. Any ways we could improve it or make it better for you. And you are going to send out Renee and Joe's contact information, right?
Yes.
So everybody can get in touch with them.
Everybody's contact info will be in it.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Have a great night.
All have a great
Thank you.
Wednesday.